All right, let's dive right in. We're going to talk about a pattern that a lot of thoughtful leaders are really trying to get their heads around.
So let's start with a really big question, one that I'm sure has crossed your mind, especially when you see these high-profile failures in organizations that were supposed to be doing so much good. It's a question that can be pretty unsettling, right?
And the answer, it turns out, isn't usually some big, dramatic moral failure. It's something much quieter, a slow, predictable creep of insecurity right into the very architecture of power. It's about how a private, internal struggle can slowly reshape an entire system from the inside out.
So really get a handle on this, we need a new way of looking at it. It's a framework called imposter syndrome migration. And the key here is that this is about systems and psychology, not just pointing a finger at one person's feelings.
Okay, so what does that actually mean? Let's break it down. You've got a leader who's privately terrified of being exposed as a fraud. Then you give that person a ton of authority. And if the system around them is weak, no real checks and balances, that private fear doesn't just stay inside their head. Nope, it starts to leak out. It becomes these external patterns of behavior, things like intense control, secrecy, and that's when it can start to cause some serious harm.
Okay, this is so important to get right. This isn't about making a moral judgment. We're not saying insecurity makes someone evil or that these leaders are sitting around twirling their mustaches, planning to do bad things. Not at all. Think of this more like a structural diagnosis. The real takeaway is this. When you mix chronic fear with unchecked power, you create a predictable risk. A person's private psychology gets cranked up to 11 by the system, and suddenly it's a public problem.
All right, so let's get under the hood. What's the hidden engine that's actually driving this whole process?
This is where things get really interesting. The source material points out this wild parallel between what we call imposter syndrome today and some really old-school theological ideas about human depravity. I mean, look at the mechanics here. In both cases, the basic idea is that you can't trust yourself. Your inner voice is suspect, and you have to get your validation from somewhere or someone else.
And that's the shared dynamic right there. Both of these frameworks basically install this deep distrust of yourself. Legitimacy isn't something you just have. It's something you have to constantly prove you deserve. It creates this feeling that you're always on the verge of being kicked out.
Okay, so now let's look at how this actually plays out. There's a predictable arc here. A series of stages where that private fear starts to morph into a public problem. It's a slow burn, not a sudden explosion.
And here it is, a 4-stage process. First, you've got that private insecurity. The leader is terrified of being found out. Then, to calm that anxiety, they start trying to control everyone and everyone around them. That's stage 2. Stage 3, it gets darker. They start using vulnerable people to get that validation they crave, creating these really unhealthy, dependent relationships. And finally, stage 4, the drift toward predation. The whole system reorients to protect the leader, not the people. Secrecy becomes protection. And just like that, what started as a leader's attempt to save themselves turns into something that can really hurt others.
Now, some environments are like gasoline on this fire. Take megachurches, for example. You often have this perfect storm of conditions, right? A leader whose authority is totally wrapped up in their charisma, their position is seen as a divine calling, and you have a community that's highly emotionally dependent on them. Mix that with super fast growth and not enough guardrails, and you've got a recipe for disaster. It's the exact environment where unresolved imposter syndrome can become incredibly dangerous.
And this is a great way to see how one person's psychology can totally infect an entire organization. If a leader has, say, an anxious attachment style, their whole team might become a culture of people pleasers, always trying to get approval. If they have a more disorganized style, you get chaos and fear. The leader's nervous system literally becomes the team's nervous system. It scales.
Okay, so if this is a systems problem, and it is, then the solution has to be systemic too. You can't just try to fix the leader's personality. We have to shift our focus away from just personalities and onto procedures.
So how do you actually stop this from happening? Well, one idea is something called a clarity interrupt. The moment you start seeing that fog of vague authority and fear roll in, you use these things called stop points. And these aren't big, dramatic showdowns. They're simple, boring procedural things, like literally writing down who gets to make what decisions, or insisting that every meeting has an agenda and a documented outcome. These little tweaks cut through the ambiguity that fear loves to hide in.
And what all this does is it lets us reframe the whole conversation. We stop hunting for individual bad apples, and we start looking at the unsafe barrels, the systems and cultures that let the rot grow in the first place. And this is maybe the most crucial point of all. Insecurity that goes unchecked.
It doesn't just magically disappear. When you can't name it, when you can't talk about it as a community, and when the system has no way to correct for it, it mutates. It doesn't die, it reorganizes. And it tends to reorganize around power, because fear craves control. And that, well, that rarely ends well.
And let me be crystal clear about this, because it's so important. This way of thinking is not an excuse for hurting people. It doesn't let anyone off the hook. In fact, it does the exact opposite. By focusing on the system, it helps us spot the red flags earlier. It pushes us toward real structural change instead of just a tearful apology. And it keeps the responsibility right where it belongs, on the broken governance, the ignored warnings, and the cultures that enabled all of it. So, if you need to boil this all down to one single sentence you can walk away with, this is it. It gives you a really careful, accurate way to talk about this stuff. It's got the personal piece, the imposter syndrome, but it also has the systemic pieces, the charisma, the power, and the missing accountability that let it spin out of control.
And that leaves us with a really powerful question we can use to check the health of any system we're in. Our job, our community, our team, whatever. Just ask yourself this. Does our system trust its leaders? Or does it force them to constantly perform to prove they deserve to be there? Because if it's the second one, that system isn't really building leaders. It's just controlling them.